Okay.
Sorry about that,
No,
everyone.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically what we're doing is trying to give a high level overview of what it is to live on a stream side and what considerations we as professionals make to help you all manage your properties across the county, help you communicate with Snohomish County, with the Conservation District, with your neighbors, and then with your families, and how you manage your properties is a direct result of having the tools and the knowledge to do that. And so hopefully we can pass some of that on today. We don't have that much time, considering some of these concepts can be, college degrees, a master's degree. We're just gonna give you a high level overview to kind of give you some of that language, some of the knowledge, so that you have the tools to communicate with folks to get the help you need to manage the properties how you would like to in a responsible way. Go to the next slide. So what we'll be talking about today, we'll start and I'll talk about some of the morphology and hydrology of Snohomish County, what that means and why it's important. And then Rob's going to take us through some of the stream ecology concepts. We'll move on to some talking about beavers, our watershed engineers that we have to manage a kind of a close relationship with, because they do change the landscape for better or for worse, depending on the angle you see it from. So how can we do that and live cooperatively with beavers? Then we'll talk about some impacts to streams, what we're seeing, what maybe you're seeing on your property, and give an overview of what that might be, and kind of some of the ways that we kind of trying to amend some of those issues. And then as we get down to, what are we actually doing in the stream, Alex is going to talk about kind of the regulatory setting and what you're allowed to do, and where you can get more information if you want to do work in your stream to kind of solve some of these issues. So we'll talk about where you can find answers, where you can find support. And then lastly, we'll answer whatever questions you have. And I think that's gonna wrap us up and probably bring us pretty close to time. So hopefully that's going to keep you engaged, and we'll answer some of your questions. Please use the Q&A and we'll answer as many of those as we can as we lead up to the end of our time today. Next slide. So to begin, this is, I think I get the most, I don't know if it's the most elegant part of the presentation, but kind of this high level overview of, what is a watershed and how is water moving throughout Snohomish County. So I don't have a lot of writing on my slides, but I'm going to read this one. A watershed is the area of land that flows to a common waterway, such as a wetland, stream, lake, river, estuary, and Puget Sound. So what we're looking at here is our basins in Snohomish County. We have Snohomish watershed, Still-Glamish watershed that are kind of the main river systems, and then we have Skagit, Lake Washington, and then Puget Sound drainages. But really we want to think about these as large containers where the water is flowing to a common water system that is eventually going into Puget Sound. Within each of these colored shapes here, the Snohomish, Still-Glamish, there are actually sub-watersheds that are smaller containers within the big container. And I think this is an important concept to understand and really pay attention to on your property, because there's always water coming from somewhere, which means there's water upstream of you and there's water downstream of you. And that means we are connected to where the water's coming from and where the water's going. And so as we think about our specific property, we're also thinking about where's this water coming from and moving through, and what impact do I have on the watershed as a whole, because this is connecting our properties and our watersheds. Next slide. So first, two concepts that I think are important to understand are stream morphology and stream hydrology. So morphology can be thought of in a couple of different ways, but morphology is kind of the shape of the stream or the shape of the watershed. So we have kind of watershed geomorphology, which is how is the water moving across one of these entire basins. And this is largely informed by geologic history, with our glaciers, and the volcanism has kind of created high points and low points and has created these containers for water to flow all the way down to a common point. And then we have stream morphology, which is how is an individual stream shaped, the one in your backyard on your property, or the one that's, the major river systems. Why do they look the way they do? How are they moving? How do they change each year? That shape is kind of our morphology. And then hydrology is really how is water moving across this landscape over time. So where does the water come from? and where does it go? And then when is that happening is an important piece of our hydrology. Is it happening in the winter and the summer? What does that look like? And how is that different? And then how long is it staying on the landscape versus maybe being underground? And then lastly, I think, between morphology, what does the landscape look like and how does that inform water flowing? And then hydrology, when and where does that water flow? Why do we care about that? And I think a lot of you are coming today because you already care in some way about these two things, whether it's stream bank erosion or the habitat isn't quite the way that you think it should be, or you just don't know and you're interested. There's some level of care that I think what we see in Snohomish County is this ethic of caring for our properties. And it's very clear that a lot of the landowners in Snohomish County, they care about their properties and you want to do what's best for them. And whatever angle that comes from, we do care and we care a lot. So hopefully that a lot of this knowledge will help us take those cares and move that into responsible management of our stream sides. So our water, if we ask the question, where does it come from? I sometimes say it comes from up high, and that can mean a couple things, but it means most of our water is coming as rainfall, right? Despite like the water cycle is a circle. If you think of the start, it comes from the sky. We're getting a lot of precipitation, but also it comes from up high in the watershed. So we're all familiar with the snow melt that happens each year, and how much water comes when all the snow melts and we start getting rain and it all rushes down and we get high water levels. So our water's coming from high in the watershed. And this is water that's moving very quickly down steep slopes from the Cascades and moving down into our watersheds. And as they come down, it kind of changes the way the water interacts with the land. And so if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see a few different stream shapes, and this is like very rudimentary. But what you see is on the bottom, a long straight run that is more characteristic of our upper watersheds where we have steeper terrain where the water doesn't really get to weave its way around. It's just going down. Gravity is moving it down. Whereas on the top is something more characteristic, and we'll see some photos in a second, of when the water hits the floodplain and it likes to spread out and it's moving and it's kind of creating these snaking, it's kind of snaking its way through the lowlands. And that's where a lot of our agriculture is. If we go to the next slide. As the water moves, we're going to see different characteristics of the stream. And so this is kind of that stream morphology that is creating, it's creating cut banks and it's creating depositional spots. So on the inside bank of some of these, you're seeing the graphic show deposition. And then in between the bends, we have those black areas, and those are kind of the runs between bends. And we usually get riffles there, and we get larger gravels dropping out. Next slide. So what this means is as the water comes down from the mountains and it kind of hits the landscape and it spreads out, we get this kind of snaking pattern across our land, and it's always moving. And if you know anything about the stream in your backyard, or the ones you see that are always depositing a new gravel bar here, or the one that you used to hang out in the summer on is now gone, that's because the river is always changing and it's kind of taking the lazy path. And so what we're looking at here is the Still-Snohomish confluence near Arlington on Highway 9. And so on the right side of your screen, you see the North Fork Still-Snohomish, the left side is the South Fork, and they kind of confluence and then they're moving into the main stem. What's important about this slide is if you can look closely and pick out how many different land uses are here, this is really the conglomerate of land uses that's informing our presentation today. We all use the land in different ways, and it's changing how our river systems run and what kind of impacts we are having on the river systems. So whether it's recreation, whether it's forestry, whether it's the urban landscape or agriculture, all of these have different impacts, and we have different expectations of the stream on our properties in these different areas. So hopefully we can answer some of those questions here. So we want to talk about the shape of the stream. We also want to talk about when water is moving there, because as you know, when we get larger flows in the wintertime, that's when a lot of our flooding happens. That's when we get a lot of erosion. And so when we look at our streams, we think about the hydrology, and we measure this with the hydrograph. And this is kind of an illustrative graph that shows us when it rains and when it's dry and how much water is actually moving through our systems. So what you can see here is the difference between an urban watershed system and a rural watershed system, where in the urban watershed system, we have a lot of impervious surface that's allowing the water to, instead of sink into the ground slowly, it's moving straight to our stormwater systems and straight into the water. And so the time it takes for it to discharge into our streams and then all the way out is much quicker than if it were to infiltrate into the ground and slowly percolate into our rivers over a longer period of time. Next slide. So that photo we were just looking at, the Snohomish River near Arlington, this is a hydrograph for a couple different years. We have our 2014-2015 year, and then the 2019-2020. You'll see the difference here is from about May in 2015, we started having a drought. And you can see the discharge was going down that whole time. We weren't getting any rain, and so less and less water was moving through the system, versus 2020 when we had a whole lot more water moving through the system later into the summer. And so this is just a way to visualize that we do have some differences year to year of how water moves. And so whether it's a very extreme winter or a very dry summer, that's going to change the effects on your stream and streams at large, and how water is moving through the watershed or not moving through the watershed. And that affects some of the impacts that we see on our local streams. Next slide. So we have, this is kind of like a natural view of a stream, where you see on a bend, we have a cut bank on one side where the water is actually pushing against the bank and causing erosion. And then on the inside bend is usually where slow water is. And it starts kind of a depositional bar environment where it's dropping out some sediments. So on the deep side of the stream, we usually have pools, and that's going to create better habitat for our fish. And then on these bars, we have a lot more depositional gravel, which creates great spawning habitat as well. So we need both, and this is always changing from year to year as it moves. So this is kind of a dynamic environment. Next slide. And so, yeah, so there's a quick photo of what that might look like on land, and that might look more familiar than the graphic here. So here's a top-down view of what a stream might look like. And if you can, I think there's a couple, if you can change the slide a couple times, you can start to see how the original river might actually start moving, where those cut banks are eroding the outside bend and depositing sediment on the inside. You might actually see an expansion of those bends, which might eventually cut off one of those bends because water is going to go through the easiest path possible. And so maybe during a flood event, it cuts off one of its bends. But until then, it's going to continue to erode out the outside bend of those turns. Next slide. So here we have that same photo, but now north is up, and we're looking straight down on that Snohomish confluence from Arlington. So on the left, the lower right of your screen, you have the South Fork Snohomish. Directly above that, you have the North Fork Snohomish coming in. And then right by Highway 9, we have the confluence, which is running in the main stem and lower Snohomish. But what I want you to do here is pick a point on this map. Maybe it's the backwards S of the Snohomish River, or maybe it's the urban area of Arlington, or maybe it's a I-5 or some of the farm fields. But pick a spot, and we're going to change the slide in a second, and we're going to look at kind of the form of the landscape and how that informs where our rivers are and how dynamic these rivers will be over time. So if you can pick a spot, Alex, I'll have you change the slide. So now we're looking at just the bare ground. This is what the bare ground looks like underneath all the vegetation and all of the urban areas and all of the development that we have. And what you can see is you can kind of pick out the main channel of the Snohomish. But even fainter than that, you can pick out some of the remnant channels where the river used to be. And then you can also see the valley is bounded by these high areas where, if you can remember where the urban development in Arlington was, that's a high area. There's a reason we built that there. And then you can kind of see where the river's been carving out in the valley. And then this big expansive lower Snohomish is very prime agriculture. And that's because the river has been moving through this area for thousands of years now and depositing lots of sediment, lots of nutrients across this area. So we have really, really great soils in there, which is why we put our farm fields there. So there's a reason why we develop where we do. And a lot of that is because of the landscape, how it's shaped, the kind of geomorphology, how it's shaped. And then we have the stream morphology where the water is actually wanting to go. And then throughout the year, we're getting these like shifts in water flow. And where the water sits and where it's depositing things. And that's our hydrology, is kind of how the water's moving over the year, over time, and how that's affecting our environment is going to be really important for the type of species that live here. So as we move on, I'll hand it over to Rob, and he'll talk about those species in the riparian areas and how that's important for kind of the system at large. So starting with the form, and now we're going to like, what is the function and how does this benefit the biotic life that's in our streams? So go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Thomas. This next segment, Stream Ecology, will focus on the riparian zone. That's the streamside vegetation. And then the energy that powers life in streams. We call them nutrients, and what happens when they get out of balance. And then also, who are the stars of this show? Who calls these streams home, and why are they important? One of the things that we did do before this webinar was look at your comments and look to see which were relevant to each of our portions of the webinar, and in the hopes of being able to answer some of your questions or concerns. So I've got at least 3 here that I will be talking about. Next. One of the ways we look at streams is at the whole watershed scale. Thomas had one look of the watershed, which describes some of the habitat and habitat forming processes. These are very important, and we always look back when we look at aquatic life to the river continuum concept, meaning the upper watershed naturally looks a little different. It's usually a smaller stream channel, and it changes to become a much broader and larger stream channel. But the influence of the vegetation on the stream side, or in other words, riparian area, changes as we move down a watershed. So do the energy sources. And then, of course, you know, much of what Thomas was describing was how sediments travel and are moved around and why. This really does shape the type of communities that we normally see. One of the important concepts here is, and for you too, is that there's connection between upstream sites and downstream. So what we do or see in upstream areas influences downstream, and it becomes cumulative. If they're negative influences on the stream, that accumulates to become a very glaring large impact in lower portions. So when we do restoration projects or encourage good stewardship, the more connected these different portions of the stream are, the more effective the impact or the influence on positive stream conditions. Next. I mentioned the riparian zone, so streamside vegetation. There's at least 3 components to streamside vegetation that are important. One of them is the understory. Here in the diagram to the right of the slide are sedges and rushes. That's the lowest growing. Then there's the let's see, what did I call it? I should have called that ground cover. The next part is the understory. So there are bushes and shrubs. Then finally, there's the overstory, overhead canopy, which are the larger trees. Each contributes a different amount of positive impact to the streams. Next. In this case here, we look at the left-hand photo. And what we're seeing is a part of the overhead canopy is missing, one side of the stream. What ends up happening here is this is a reach where waters start to warm, especially at the height of the sun and heat of the day. Whereas on the right-hand side, a more intact overhead canopy provides more shading, no matter where the sun is in the sky. The process really is in the radiant heat that's acquired by the underlying substrate, the rocks, and it heats up over the course as the water makes its way down, much of the overlying water, and that becomes cumulative if, in fact, the riparian vegetation is not intact. Next. One of the things that it's important also to note, I know this is a busy slide, but is there are a couple of energy sources that fuel life in our streams. One is the sun through photosynthetic activity in the upper right, the growth of algae, and then a select segment of the invertebrate community that uses algae as food. The other is organic material like leaves, sticks, and twigs. What we end up with is an energy source that comes from outside of the stream. Normally, this is contributed in a major way in the upper portion of a watershed, mid portion, not so much at the lower end. So you can see how animals take advantage not only of these primary energy sources, but also of each other. There are predatory invertebrates that eat other invertebrates that are eating algae. And finally, the fish. It's a big food source for fish of all life stages. Next. The nutrients that we refer to are, and components of those are the nitrogen, phosphorus, and then also oxygen and carbon. These are all the elements that are necessary in order to enable the aquatic life to live. In fact, it's part of the metabolic process. Next. When we have an excess of some of these nutrients, like phosphorus, we get a condition that we see in the photo on the left. That is excess algal growth. It could lead to excess plant growth. It alters the dissolved oxygen concentrations. It lowers them, especially when we get to the lowest levels in the early morning hours of a day. This is when it makes it very tough conditions for survival, for fish especially, and many of the invertebrates. Of course, the photo on the right is exactly what our aquatic life would prefer to see. Next. Some of the impacts that we do see are physical habitat-based, and others are stormwater. Some of the things that you've read or heard or have seen in other seminars or webinars are things like copper and zinc, metals that originate from much of the automobile traffic on our roadways. Another one that was discovered here in the last few years was tire wear particles. They also refer to it by the chemical name 6-PPD quinone. It's actually an element that is an antioxidizer that's additive to rubber. And it has some very, very harmful effects to some of our salmon species. And also fine sediment is washed in by stormwater and often smothers a habitat space in the bottom of streams, and that makes it very difficult for egg survival for our salmonids. Physical habitat, we have the big four. Right below that title, we have stream bank erosion that results in transport of that sediment. It fills in pools, it deposits all over the stream. Next. The stormwater impacts from the antioxidizer that I had mentioned, the tire wear particles, causes complete mortality in coho. More recently, it was reported in a paper that Chinook and the steelhead trout are also affected by these, not to the same degree, but they still are. And of course, the Chinook is in focus right now, a very important species. especially as it is consumed by the orca. Steelhead trout, a staple, to a lot of people and all other animals. Next. Examples of stream bank erosion you see on the left photo. This is the beginning of where sediment enters streams. It can either be caused by water running overland because there is a lack of riparian vegetation or ground cover, or it can be caused by very high flows that are flashy, meaning they come up and they go down very rapidly. It erodes these banks, and then that sediment is transported. And on the right, you see little islands that have been deposited by previous high flow conditions, likely during the wintertime. And you can see too that the sediment is scattered all the way across the stream. We don't see very many larger rocks, which are ideal for many of the life strategies and life stages for stream animals. One of the other things, go ahead, next. Next slide. Thank you. Beavers. This will be the next segment of the webinar, but beavers are beneficial as well. They can be a real nuisance, depending. This is a stream that is in a forested area as part of the South Fork Snohomish. Pay attention, if you would, to the stump on the right-hand side of each of these photos. The stump, when we look at the area that was inundated by this beaver dam upstream, we can see that there's a lot of fine sediment that's stored behind the dam. This is on that lower right portion of the upper photo. When you look at the below dam, after this beaver dam blew out, much of that sediment then washed through and now is coming through on the bottom end. So there are some benefits to this. Fine sediment can be stored as well as water by beaver dams, and this is especially a beneficial type of feature during low flow portions of the year when water is a little more scarce. Or if we're in a drought year, the water stored behind these dams can actually be beneficial. There was a very large one that had blown out. It was right across from the Brightwater complex on Little Bear Creek. And the remains of the fine sediment can still be seen there. And anyways, it's a very necessary feature on the landscape for conserving water. Next. So here are the stars that we wanted to talk about and examine a little further of our freshwater streams. The plankton, which are some of the smallest of animals and are food base for many of the aquatic insects or macroinvertebrates. Mussels and snails are important components. I'll describe a little bit about our freshwater mussels. Amphibians, frogs and salamanders, and then the stars of the show. Those are our salmonid species. Next. These small plankton, they are animals. We also have phytoplankton, which would be plants. The zooplankton here are some of the primary portion of the food base, and they're the beginning of the food web that we looked at earlier. Next. The aquatic invertebrates come in a variety of shapes and forms. Here you're primarily looking at stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. There's one snail in the mid-left portion of this diagram. Next. Looking at some of the more charismatic microfauna, as I refer to them, the stoneflies on the left, they have both larval form and then the adult form. You can see one on top of the other. Same with mayflies. Some of you may be able to identify these by looking at the number of tails. In general, the stoneflies have 2 tails and mayflies have 3. But there is a family of mayflies that actually only have 2. So it's like anything else that we have to memorize or learn in mathematics, the language. There are always exceptions. Next. Caddisflies are interesting. They're a very diverse group. They are distributed broadly and in freshwater streams. The photo on the right shows or illustrates a caddisfly that builds a net and catches organic material. It actually filters, so it's called a filter feeder, and then it eats that entire net. And that is that's its living and how it captures its food. Others, like the caddisfly on the upper left, is grazing on algae on rocks, and then the caddisfly on the lower left is actually a predatory caddisfly. It spins a single web, almost like a climber's rope, and it anchors it to a small stone as it moves around. If it's dislodged, at least it won't get washed downstream. Next. There are slower water animals, such as in lakes and ponds and wetlands. Some of our streams are large enough where they have very slow running water on the margins during low flow portion of the year. And we get some of these kinds of animals. The beetles are very diverse. There's the water boatman. We see the water strider on fast and slow running streams. That's in the lower right. Next. The freshwater mussels are an interesting and very strong indicator we've found now of how streams are doing. The reason freshwater mussels are of interest to us is that they are connected solidly with salmonid species as hosts to help them redistribute themselves and the young to other portions of the drainage. When we see that some of these mussel populations are aging and there's no new or smaller mussels like the one you see in the upper middle portion of this slide, it means no new recruitment, we say. And that means it's just an aging population that has not had the ability to be able to redistribute itself or reproduce. And that means that there's been a disconnect in its life cycle. And the following slide, next, is why. When we look at the bottom center of this life cycle for freshwater mussels, the breeding occurs, and Glaucidia, a tiny mussel-like organism, starts to grow, and that's the one in the middle right of this diagram. It has sharp teeth, not quite shown here, but those teeth latch on to gill filaments, and you'll see that depicted on the upper portion of this life cycle. Gill filaments of a fish, and it has to be a salmonid, one of the salmon species, cutthroat or rainbow trout. And the skin of the gill filament grows over this glaucidium and that little mussel. That mussel then will eat its way out when it reaches a suitable location and then hope for survival. Why do they let go, and what are the cues? We don't know. We have some guesses. It's just that we do know that the freshwater mussels were very important. They were not a preferred food base for the tribes throughout the region, but we do know there were massive middens, meaning mussel piles, ones that were consumed along trade routes and routes for travel. And so they were for sustenance, but not preferred. Of course, big game and salmon were the preference. So, these things have been around a long time, and they were well distributed based on what we know about where these middens have been deposited. Next slide. Some of the others that I mentioned, the amphibians, the Pacific and red-legged frogs are native to our area and important parts of our riparian ecosystem. The coastal giant and Cascade torrent salamanders, others as well. These are just to introduce you to some of the players that are important in our area that you may not have known about, and when you see them, you'll know who they are. Next. And finally, the stars of our show, the charismatic megafauna in our streams. the 5 salmon species, each having a little bit of a different requirement for as far as habitat, as far as water quality, as far as timing and when water needs to be flowing in their streams that they return to. Thomas had described a little bit about what drought years look like and higher flow years. That's really important depending on which species. So I guess, aquatic life needs water apparently to survive. Here you're seeing ocean phase and spawning phase. The spawning phase looks very different in some cases from those ocean-going phases. Next. The salmon life cycle is pretty straightforward. I think most of us have seen this or diagrams, but starts with an egg and the right middle portion, alevin emerges from the gravels. They start to grow, fry, they lose their egg sac, and then they develop into smolts that start out migrating to the salt water and finally take that long journey. It's interesting that if they could only tell their story, and I guess it's a long journey for some of them. Some of them, like the Chinook salmon, up to 5 years salt. They encounter an awful lot of things out there, and then they get back to our streams and either make it or don't make it. It just seems like we could do more. Next. The condition of some of our fish in the Puget Sound, and in particular in Snohomish County, chum, pink, and sockeye salmon seem to be doing okay. The coho salmon is threatened, and threatened mainly we see because of some of the pollutants that we found washing in from roadways and stormwater. What's kind of ironic is we've been doing restoration work for a while, not knowing that the stormwater was actually undoing some of the good in some respects that we were trying to make progress on. But thank goodness, we're always moving forward. There are always researchers that have some very good ideas and have been delving into these much more complex issues. Next. The Chinook salmon. This one is threatened in the Puget Sound, and this one is kind of a sentinel species because of its importance to the larger mammal, the orca. It often drives the type of restoration projects and whether restoration projects get done in some of our streams. So often requires much larger gravels than any of the others. It finds the deepest portions of our streams. And so, when we think about what we can do to minimize erosion and sediments that fill pools, these are the primary habitats these larger fish will use. And so it's really important that we do pay attention to the types of things that we can do to attract these fish back. Next. We do have the cutthroat trout and resident rainbow are doing fine. The steelhead and the bull trout, though, are threatened. So steelhead, of course, is the sea-run rainbow. Bull trout is not. It's actually landlocked. It doesn't run to the ocean. But we do have those, and they are considered threatened. Next. And now I pass the next segment off to our next speaker.
Thanks for that, Rob. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I am going to be hopping in now to give a very high-level, quick kind of overview of living with beavers. Thomas mentioned we really just don't have enough time tonight to kind of delve in as deep on these ideas as we would love to on each of them. But I'm partly going to kind of try and breeze through this because in just a few weeks, I think on December 1st, the Conservation District is actually hosting a similar workshop to this, but completely on this topic. So all about living with beavers. And we'll also have an opportunity to see some beaver activity at our field tour on Saturday. So folks are coming to that. So I'm going to just kind of breeze through this to give an overview of kind of what we're looking at. But there are definitely opportunities for folks to kind of dig in deeper if you have beavers on your property or it's just something you're more interested in. Let's see. So many of us are familiar with images like this, the kind of typical kind of signs of beaver activity. Beavers are actually nocturnal, so more likely to see the signs of beaver activity than you are to see a beaver. I've been, going out on site visits to view, see what's going on with beavers on people's properties for several years now, and I've only seen a beaver in person, I think 2 or 3 times. So it doesn't happen as often because I work during work hours. But we're all familiar with these. They chop down trees. They're chewing. They build dams. They have lodges. And really, what that's all about is they're a large rodent. So they're the largest rodent in North America. And part of that status is that they're incredibly awkward on land, but really amazing swimmers. So they really prefer these wet, well-ponded areas to kind of basically spend their time and build their homes in, because that's where they're safest. That's where they're most comfortable. They're, very at risk to predators when they're on land. And as Rob touched on, they certainly do impact the landscape in ways that can be really beneficial. So this is a kind of site that most folks have seen. We have lots of kind of wetland areas in our region, because of all the rain we tend to get. But if you stop and kind of look a little more closely at scenes like this, you can often see kind of signs of this is actually kind of a series of beaver dams that have been there for quite a long time. So vegetation is now growing up all over it, but it's doing a lot of work to store this water and build habitat. So some of the, beneficial things going on here that Rob already touched on is, these things, hold water. So when also going back to Thomas's slide with that hydrograph where, in the urban side, you had that big flashy peak when we get our, a big flush of rain in the winter. This is helping kind of level that hydrograph back out. So rather than letting everything just kind of fire hose down through the system all in one shot, these beaver dams kind of give an opportunity for that water to get held up, slow down. Some of that sediment comes out. As Thomas mentioned, again, the groundwater, this allows more water to soak into the ground so that, the water coming down out downstream is cooler, it's cleaner, and it's coming out, more slowly in a more metered fashion. So there are a lot of reasons we like beaver on our landscape, which is why we try to live with them whenever possible. That said, obviously, when they're doing what they do in areas where we have infrastructure or are living, there can be conflicts. They can flood our roads, they flood our fields, they plug our culverts, they chop down the trees that we're trying to plant. And so there are definitely a lot of different ways we've kind of learned to try and figure out a way to work with beaver. It really is, again, part of the reason I'm breezing through this is because it really does require a bit more to kind of delve into, site-specific things. So if you have a beaver situation on your property that you're trying to figure out how to manage, it's definitely best to kind of talk to somebody to kind of really get a sense of what's going on your site and figure out what management approaches might make the most sense, might have the highest likelihood of success. So it's really kind of does require that kind of site-specific kind of consideration. So, but I'm going to quickly kind of run through and give you an idea of kind of what some of these tools we have in our toolbox are. This is something called a notch exclusion device. And actually, before I even talk about this, the kind of solution that is kind of first and foremost, so like the gold standard is the do nothing, management approach. So whenever possible, if, beavers can be just allowed to continue what they're doing, if that's something that, you as a landowner can tolerate and it's not threatening infrastructure or your land use, that's definitely, the preferred option, both in terms of kind of retaining the benefits that those beavers are providing. And frankly, it's just the simplest management option for you to be having to kind of navigate. That said, not always able to do that. So these are some of the tools we have if that's not an option. This is something called a notch exclusion device. One of the simplest management options is if you have a dam on your property that's causing the water to come up too high, is to just simply notch the dam when that water comes up too high. We'll see that at our field tour on Saturday. They have a number of beaver dams. Most of them they just leave alone. There's one that's kind of in proximity to some of their infrastructure, so they mostly just leave it alone. But when water comes up at its highest, they will occasionally go and put a little notch in it, which is just kind of using hand tools to create a little bit of an indent in the top of the dam, just one little spot to let that water keep moving through and bring the water level down. This device essentially kind of just makes that a little more permanent. I put that in air quotes because beavers can definitely sometimes disrupt these and get through those cages, but the idea is that you can put the notch in and kind of build this cage around so that they won't be as readily able to just plug it back up, because without a cage they certainly will do that very quickly. Before I move on to the next one, just a quick note, and I'll touch on this a little bit more in the regulation section in just a little bit. But basically, any of these solutions where you're in the stream, tinkering with the beaver dam or messing with the flow or putting in one of these devices would require a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is a solution that is less available to us these days for kind of regulatory reasons, but in certain cases we can use it. It's similar to that exclusion device, but instead of just building a cage around the notch, you actually have a pipe that runs through that notch. And some, when it can be used, some folks find it to be a little more effective because it's less, it's more difficult for beavers to thwart. Culvert exclusion is something we work with a lot. Beavers really like plugging culverts because, the roads we build over streams or through wetlands are just really super highly engineered beaver dams as far as they're concerned. We just messed up and popped a little hole in it. So all they got to do is, stuff some sticks and mud in one little hole, and they've got, a beautiful dam that's, going to be in good shape for a long time. So this is something that the county in particular deals with a lot on county roads. We put in different types of, this is just one example of a design that you can use to basically exclude beavers from being able to get into that culvert and plug it. If they're simply, not causing flooding issues, but, mowing down vegetation that you like or trying to get established, you can really use a simple cage. This is from a kind of restoration project. We use this a lot because we're often working in proximity to beavers and are trying to get vegetation established, like these conifer trees. And I like this picture in particular because it's kind of a triage thing where, we really want to protect those conifer trees, but we're less concerned, they can have all the willow they want. And this kind of up front, you can see they've been chewing on that. So we kind of leave that for them, go crazy, but we're just going to put some caging around this vegetation to protect it so we can get it established. And then I'll close with just a kind of quick word on trapping, just because this is one of the, basically for most folks, this is kind of like the first thing that pops in their mind. Folks have beaver move into their property. Trapping is the kind of the first solution that pops into their mind. And I just wanted to touch on it because it's not quite the solution that folks tend to think it is. And the long and short of that is that generally speaking, if you have beaver on a given site, it's probably because it's a pretty good spot for a beaver to be. Our beaver populations are, have been expanding, so they're cropping up in areas where they haven't been. So trapping all the beaver out is expensive, requires permits. It does tend to be a lethal, generally speaking, trappers do have to euthanize animals after they live trap them. And it can buy you some time, but how much time it is anybody's guess. So folks tend to think if I can just trap them, get them out of there, I'll be back to, the way things were. And unfortunately, it's just not that simple. So that's another reason why, in addition to all the benefits beavers provide, we really do encourage folks to look for those solutions where we can find a way to mitigate the impacts that they're having, but still allow them to, live among us, stay on site, continue to provide some of those benefits, even if we have to kind of manage things a little bit. With that, I will pass it back over to Thomas.
Great, thanks, Alex. So now we're going to kind of reiterate some of what Rob said, but in a little bit of a different context. Rob had a great intro and review of kind of the biotic life that's in our rivers and streams. And I want to also recognize that we live on these streams, and these are very important properties to us, whether it's our infrastructure is close to the stream, or we have a connection with the land that we find very important. A lot of the impacts to a stream are directly how we manage it and how our neighbors manage it upstream and downstream. So I want to talk about some of the impacts to streams, and I also want to recognize that we're focusing a lot on the negative impacts that we can have on the streams, but we can also have positive impacts. So I'm going to end this section with some positive impacts and kind of one of the solutions that we promote around the county. Next slide. So you saw a lot of this content in Rob's section about what kind of pollutions are in our rivers and streams. And I put this photo back up to show there's a lot of different land uses that have their own pollutions associated with them, whether it's the urban landscape with the tire wear particles or metals, or construction with fine sediment inputs from active construction, or if it's fertilizers, kind of loading the stream with phosphorus and nitrogen that is kind of above normal levels for kind of the balanced ecosystem. I also want to recognize that temperature is a very important input to a stream that we often consider as a pollution, because high temperatures are lethal to a lot of aquatic life, especially salmon. So once you get water, it's getting around 60 degrees, salmon are not happy, and you get much above that and it can actually be lethal. So we do consider temperature loading in our streams, those hot summer days, full sun, and the low water levels in our streams create these kind of temperature situations where water is just too hot for salmon. And so we want to find ways to reduce that. And then the physical habitat with the amount of sediment that's just naturally moving through these systems. The loss of pools, whether it's a natural landslide or the input of a lot of sediment from maybe there's a slide on the bank because there's more storm water and we have more water running through, and the pressure from all this flow is actually creating more erosion than might be natural, and creating more sedimentation. So whether it's a natural process or kind of an impact from human activities, these are all creating impacts to the streams that can be potentially harmful to aquatic life and also to your properties, because the water's kind of changing the way it wants to go. Next slide. So one of these first impacts, we see a lot of erosion. So this photo is from the Pilchuck River, and this is extreme, right? I know some of you are tuning in because you do have erosion and you want some strategies to kind of slow that erosion down or try and control the river a little bit. This is the Pilchuck River. There's a lot of water that moves through very quick, and the soils are very gravelly and very prone to sliding. So where it runs into a hill on the outside bank, we get these very extreme kind of jaw-dropping images and situations where here you see a house on a hill that looks like it's about to fall into the river. So this is a drastic example of an issue you see on almost every cut bank on a river, is that the water is carving out the land, and it is moving sediment, and this is just an extreme example. There are risks to infrastructure, and there's risk to the properties that we have. And so as you feel like you're losing part of your property or you have a threat to infrastructure, there are some ways that we can try and combat this. When you get into really extreme strategies, there's permits involved, but there's some lighter touch kind of strategies, namely habitat restoration and native planting, that can help solve some of this. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. We also have a history of straightening out our channels, our stream channels in the Northwest. to make more space for agriculture and other land uses, which was great for maximizing land use and was had a pretty big negative impact on our watersheds and how water moves through them, at what rate, and what kind of habitat is available to species. So we see a decrease in refuge for a lot of our aquatic species and our nearshore species in the riparian area. When we take out all of the trees, all of the floodplain forests, and we straighten our channels, we don't have a lot of that kind of bank protection for the species, and there's not a lot of structural protection along the banks for our terrestrial species. When we do straighten out and clear the riparian areas, we open up the river to a lot of thermal loading from the sun. We just get so much temperature inputs that there's nothing keeping the sun from heating up that water, and it happens very quickly. As soon as June, July rolls around, this water is heating up, and it doesn't have anything to cool it down besides the groundwater coming in, but there's no shade blocking the sun to keep it cool. We see an increase in pollution when we lose vegetation, because our riparian areas are really good at holding a lot of flood water, filtering a lot of nutrients, and slowly letting it percolate back into the stream, and letting a lot of those pollutants that we were talking about, maybe some of the fertilizers or the heavy metals that might be in the water, as it percolates to the soil, it sticks to it. And there's different plants that can kind of break it down into various components that are not so harmful. So it's really important to have these spaces for water to filter through the land. And that's kind of where we get into this storage concept, where we like to store our water outside of the stream, because that allows it to infiltrate slower, and it allows cold water to be underground. And if it's not getting hit by the sun, it's not heating up. And so water that's underground is cold water, and as it filters back into the stream, that's a cold water input, but it's not happening right away. It's happening later in the year. So some of our winter snow melt and some of the late spring rains are actually filtering through the ground slowly, and they're entering our streams in the summer when the rest of the water is very hot, and so it's lowering that water temperature. If we don't have our floodplain wetlands, if we don't have our forests, then we usually have a reduced storage capacity for water to infiltrate and stay on, like, in the land before it flows out into our streams. And so by modifying our riparian areas, we don't have storage, we have increased pollution, the temperature starts to rise, and there's not good refuge habitat for our aquatic and terrestrial species. Next. And then I did notice that a lot of you might be tuning in because you have certain invasive plants on your property along the stream, and you're wondering, how am I supposed to manage this? I've heard I could do this, here I can do that, but what can we actually do to manage them? So this first one, what you see here is Himalayan blackberry. There's several blackberry species that have kind of taken over Puget Sound. We only have one that's native, and it trails across the ground. So if you see blackberry that's standing on its own, likely invasive, and it's something that we will want to take care of. Usually with blackberry, the best route is to take it out by hand and get all of the roots, but that is very labor intensive, and it takes a lot of persistence, and that's kind of the name of the game with some of our weeds. There are some chemical solutions to blackberry control, and those are options that talk to your conservation district, talk to Alex at the county, and kind of see, is this the right option for my property? There's a lot of considerations there that we won't get into, but blackberry is manageable, and there's a lot that we can replace to really increase the form, the function, and the habitat here of the riparian area. Next. This you might recognize is very prevalent in understories along riparian areas, and this is English ivy. And this is particularly harmful for kind of our old trees that with all this pressure, these vines tend to climb and hang on branches and create a lot of weight. And then when we get windstorms, the tree has a hard time holding itself up, and the ivy can actually smother out a lot of the sunlight. So the sunlight needs that a tree has, it's not getting because there's ivy in the way. And then it also is just covering the ground, kind of carpeting the understory of the forest, preventing a lot of these small herbaceous species to grow and habitat, whether it's for pollinators or for the smaller species, to create kind of a diverse habitat. This is creating a monoculture, a carpet of ivy that is pretty detrimental to the forest floor. And this is usually a manual removal type deal, which means lots and lots of labor. But this does not respond to herbicide very well, and can really be pesky. And it is another one where persistence will pay off and take a little bit at a time, and you can make some progress. Next. Here's a picture of reed canary grass. This is kind of some of that tall grass you might see on the edges of your streams or in your wetlands that grows 7 feet tall in the summertime, and creates this kind of monoculture that definitely is taking over all of the other native plants. Really loves the wet areas, so we don't like to do any sort of herbicide work in most cases because it's too close to the water. The best way is not to remove this physically, but to introduce competition with native plants to try and outcompete this, and there's a few strategies to do that. So usually this is dense plantings of willow species to shade that out, and once you start shading out and reducing the density of the reed canary grass, you can start introducing other species. I know sometimes we're put off by like one monoculture replacing another one, but it's always a matter of taking steps to reduce invasives, introduce natives, and then start introducing more diversity along the way. Next. The last one I'll talk about is knotweed. We have a couple knotweed species that are kind of lining a lot of our streams and rivers. And this is one that spreads very, very quickly. So we usually advise against any sort of mowing and manual removal, because any part of this plant can float downstream and reroot and create a new stand, and it grows very aggressively. And the root systems are incredibly fragile. So it was kind of evolved to be fragile and to move down river systems very easily. So it's very difficult to remove, and it grows very fast each year and then dies back. So this is usually one where we take a watershed approach, and we work from the upper watershed and move down as we try and control anything that could float downstream. And as we do that, we're using chemical control in a very controlled way and strategic way to try and reduce these populations. If you have this on your property and you're trying to kind of remove it and restore it, contact us and we can kind of talk about the best strategy to go about this. There is some chemical advice we can give and really guide you through that process, because it can be intimidating, and we really don't like to add too many foreign chemicals, but sometimes it's the only tool we have for certain weeds, and knotweed is usually one of those that we do consider using chemical control, and it is effective when used in moderation. Next. So we talk about our impacts. One of the most positive impacts we can have is restoring some of our native species and restoring the diversity to help future generations of these plant communities grow and help them to reproduce on their own, so we can have these naturally occurring forests once again. It is the most cost-effective way to ensure that we're reducing the negative impacts that we just went over, and restoring the function of the riparian habitat to a level that all of our species are happier and healthier because of it. Next slide. So there are a few steps, and this is very intuitive, so we'll breeze through, but basically, if you hit next, Alex, you can kind of see the result. We want to remove our invasive species, whether that's manually, chemically, or just over time, just being persistent to remove these things. In phases, we can soon be ready to have a planting area that won't be outcompeted right away by that same invasive species that we try to take out. So once we control that, we move on to step 2, which is planting. And there's a lot of native plant nurseries around Snohomish County and Puget Sound that can provide really, really healthy native plant stock that we can help kind of design a plant palette for your property. And there's a lot of considerations there that we can't get into, but you know what these plants need for water, for sunlight, for shade, picking the appropriate plants and putting them in the ground in kind of a diverse way, and trying to mimic what we see already on the landscape is going to really produce a species diversity and a structural diversity that's very effective for restoring habitat and function for a lot of a lot of the species, as well as providing shade for the stream or providing kind of a filtration system for some of these pollution inputs. Next slide. After planting, the most important part of our restoration is doing the maintenance. So here you see a project planted in rows to allow someone to go down with a tractor and mow it. A lot of us don't have property like this, but the idea is that we want our maintenance to be as easy as possible. If you go to the next slide, so that we can keep these plants alive and give them a fighting chance, because once you plant it, it doesn't mean there's no pressures or competition for your new plants. Maintaining them is the first way to ensure that they succeed and they're not smothered out by new invasives from coming in on disturbed ground, or the same invasive that you thought you controlled. It will come back. They always do. So we want to be persistent in controlling those. And then the last step is watch them grow and take care of them. And over time, we're playing the long game, but over time, we start to create these kind of forest communities that are really beneficial to the streams that we live on. And I think you can really see the changes on your property over time if you do install a plant community that is kind of evolved to live in the Pacific Northwest. And that there's a lot of flexibility here. You don't have to plant a forest every time, but we do want to try and reintroduce and replace some of our invasives with native species. And with that, we'll go on to the next section where Alex, I think you'll take it away.
Thanks, Thomas. That was great. Yeah, Thomas did a great job of running us through all the fun stuff about restoring your streamside forest. And I get to close this out with giving you a brief primer on all the regulations that come with being a streamside landowner. So this is again another section where much more time could be dedicated to this. And so this is certainly not intended to give you a complete, comprehensive, everything you need to know, but just trying to give you a sense of kind of what the landscape looks like as a streamside landowner, what kind of questions you might ask. And kind of Thomas alluded to this, that a lot of the kind of management techniques for those different invasive species really come down to site-specific considerations. So this is really our hope is definitely that, if you have questions about this, or you're, wanting to figure out what you can do on your property, you have questions about what you can and can't do, or you want to do a project, but you're not sure how to start, we're definitely hoping that this is kind of like a first point of contact. Not that all of your questions will get answered tonight, or that you have everything you need, but trying to just give you like a lay of the land so that you feel a little more encouraged and empowered to kind of move forward with some of these things. So I'm going to run through this stuff. Feel free to ask questions in Q&A. We'll answer what we can, but definitely, this is kind of a jumping off point. So we'll talk a little bit about, why are there regulations for streams, wetlands, and other critical areas. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of kind of the layers of regulations we have at the local, state, and federal levels, and give you a sense of kind of what types of things are regulated. So before I even, jump into that again, my kind of key take-home messages for this section are that there are this kind of overlapping, layers of regulations to be cognizant of related to activities, in and near streams at every level of government, at the local, state, and federal level. As may seem blazingly obvious by that first bullet point, navigating these regulations certainly can be challenging and confusing, especially, as a landowner who has no prior experience kind of working through these. So the third bullet point is to reach out to me, Thomas, and some of the other folks will kind of mention at the end. If you have questions about this, reach out. I'm not speaking to this as a regulator. I'm with Surface Water Management is not a regulatory division, so I'm not with the county's, regulatory division. But we have to navigate these same regulations when we're doing projects. So, we have experience working through them. Part of our job is to, understand them as best we can to provide some of this guidance to you. So, we will do the best we can to kind of help you navigate. And again, a lot of it comes down to kind of case by case, site specific things minor differences in a proposal can really kind of shift what kind of the regulatory pathway looks like, which makes it difficult to kind of just kind of give blanket advice, but we can kind of give you an idea. So I'm going to start with this kind of idea of why do we have these regulations, and I'm going to give certainly an overly broad, overly simplistic answer because I'm basically attempting to answer this question on behalf of every level of government, over the course of several decades. So certainly putting words in somebody's mouth somewhere, but essentially, these regulations have been put in place relatively recently in the scheme of things to try and kind of walk back or reduce the harm that can come about, can even be inherent in just kind of an uncoordinated approach to managing our landscape. And this slide, is certainly not intended to convey that everything in the 1940 slide was pitch perfect and everything in 2015 is run amok. This kind of completely straightened river channel should have some alarm bells going off after Thomas's talk at the top. But it is just to convey that, our landscape has changed, our population has grown, and as that's happened, it's just harder and harder. It became harder and harder to ignore the impacts of the actions we were having developing this landscape. Something that may have been a drop in the bucket and nobody noticed any impact in 1940 wouldn't be the case in 2015. So as we started to notice that we were having these impacts over time, different governmental agencies looking at different, with different lenses and perspectives on different resources, started to kind of implement these layers of regulations. They certainly don't do that perfectly. There's certainly some duplication. Sometimes there's even some contradiction, but that's the landscape we have. So coming to this idea that we have these layers of regulations, which is something I'll come back to over and over. So at the local level, we have a critical areas ordinance and shoreline management program. And again, just another caveat that this is not comprehensive, but these are kind of some of the things that I thought most pertinent to Streamside folks, such as yourself. I'll spend most of my time on this layer, but there are also regulations to be aware of at the state level with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Natural Resources, as well as the federal level with the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So bringing it back to this local level, start off kind of just talking about critical areas. Critical areas are administered at the local level. So if you live in unincorporated Snohomish County, the county will have a set of critical areas regulations. I know there are some folks on the call in the city of Lake Stevens, and in that case, you would have to adhere to the city of Lake Stevens's critical areas regulations, but they are implemented as part of the state's statewide Growth Management Act. So the state Growth Management Act basically appoints local jurisdictions to implement their own critical areas regulations with state guidance. So they do vary a bit from county to county, city to city. And what we're really talking about with critical areas is a number of things. So they're broken out into a few categories. So fish and wildlife conservation, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, which have a number of subcategories. So especially important to all of us here, streams, wetlands, lakes, also includes marine waters, frequently flooded areas, wildlife conservation areas, and buffers, which I put asterisks on to remind myself to flag. So not entirely intuitive necessarily to folks, but a lot of these critical areas have built into them a regulatory buffer is what we call it. So a simple example on streams, different types of streams have different buffers that are protected along with them. So for example, in Snohomish County, a salmon bearing stream has a regulatory buffer of 150 feet. So that means not only is that stream channel considered a critical area, but 150 feet upland from that stream bank is also included in those regulations. These regulations also cover things like geologically hazardous areas, which are things like steep slopes or areas that are prone to landslides. Channel migration zones, which some folks, if you live on a larger river system, there are kind of areas set aside as designated as channel migration zones, where those rivers are prone to move, kind of like you saw on those one of Thomas's early slides, where you could see all the remnant channels. And so that has a, certain activities are regulated in those areas to protect development. It also includes critical aquifer recharge areas. So kind of a corollary to these regulations are an NGPA or a CAPA. So a lot of you folks have probably seen these signs or heard that term, native growth protection area. So NGPA, CAPA stands for native growth protection area or critical area protection area, which is what the county now calls them for new development. A little bit of a silly name, but again, it's what we've got to work with. These are areas that are established through the permitting process for permitting development on properties with critical areas. So these are essentially areas that are designated as protected on something called the critical area site plan, which is something you develop if you're, develop permitting development on an individual parcel, or a plat map if it's something like a subdivision. So essentially what that means is that if you have a parcel with a wetland on it, that wetland and its buffer are protected by those regulations. However, it's only when you get to the point of actually proposing to develop on that property that you actually have to go through the steps of having a professional determine exactly where the boundary of that wetland is and categorize it and rate it so you can determine exactly what the buffer is and where it ends. And that's what gets established, kind of drawn on that map. You put up a fence or put up signs to establish that as a protected area. So it's not that the area wasn't protected before it had an NGPA sign up. It's just that's how it gets established through the formal permitting process. Just a quick note that if you have these areas on your property, that doesn't mean that there are no critical areas outside those. So, depending on when those were established, things change. These areas are dynamic. So it's definitely, you still have to be cognizant of that moving forward. So when you're working in these areas, a quick rundown of activities that are likely to require permits. Earth moving, so any sort of excavation, fill, grading, dredging in these areas is likely to trigger a permit process. Clearing, tree removal, brush control, that can even include, brush control with an herbicide. So even if you're not actually chopping anything down, if you're clearing that vegetation, that can trigger a permit process. Generally, outside of a critical area, these things often have thresholds where, you're allowed to clear up to a certain amount or move a certain amount of fill before you trigger a permit process. But within a critical area, that threshold is essentially 0. So if you're doing any amount of that, you're kind of thrust into that permitting process. Development and construction, stream flow alteration, and stream bed or bank alteration. So even if you're doing something like a restoration project where you're working in the stream, putting logs in the stream, putting wood on a bank, bringing in cobbles that are, more fish friendly, doing any of that work in the stream will also trigger permits, which is a good kind of caveat just to say that something, things requiring permits on this list doesn't just inherently mean that it's not allowed under any circumstance or it's inherently bad. Even again, us proposing to do restoration projects still have to go through these permitting processes to kind of make sure we're doing it appropriately. We're taking things into consideration and make sure we're not having any unintended consequences, as a result of the final product or the process of putting it in. And if, we can't avoid those, taking steps to mitigate those impacts. There are some things that are not likely to require permits. Touching on what Thomas was talking about, so a lot of that restoration work, so invasive species control generally in these areas will not require a permit. So if you have, reed canary grass or blackberry, that you want to start working on in these areas, definitely, for the most part, you should feel empowered to do that. And if you're doing that, we certainly hope you follow up with, getting plants in the ground. And that is another thing that you would not require a permit for. Pedestrian access. This is something, this is a question I get a ton. So folks who have those NGPA signs basically often think they're not supposed to set foot past that sign. Anybody going in there is, against the law. The cops are going to come running down and get them any second. To the contrary, we actually really encourage folks to kind of engage with those areas. Walking through them is perfectly fine. And it's great because if you the more you're using that area or enjoying that area or engage with that area, the more likely you are to notice issues that need to be addressed, the more invested you'll be in taking care of it. So certainly pedestrian access is okay. On a similar note, passive recreation. So say you want to, go fishing in the stream, you have to walk through the buffer, totally okay. Foraging, things like berry picking or mushroom hunting, also totally okay. I believe there might be a small asterisk on that, that this is not intended to be, agricultural. So I don't think you're supposed to, go berry picking or mushroom hunting in there in your NGPA and then go take them to the farmer's market. But if it's just for personal consumption, that is okay. Another question I get a ton is about hazard trees. So trees are protected in these native growth protection areas or critical areas and their buffers. The one kind of exception to that are hazard trees. There isn't a formal permit process for removing a hazard tree, but there is an approval process through the county. So essentially, in order to remove one of those trees, you have to have an arborist actually certify it as a hazard tree. There's kind of two key components to that. One is that it's actually certified by an arborist as likely to fail or fall. And two, if it does fail or fall, it would damage structure. So if it would fall in a house, a shed, something like that. If it's just going to fall and block a walking trail in by the stream, that would not constitute a hazard tree. One other kind of overlapping set of local regulations that I'll touch on briefly is a shoreline management program, so SMP. So similar to the kind of Growth Management Act with the critical areas regulations, SMPs are put in place by state law, the Shoreline Management Act, that puts the authority on local jurisdictions to develop their own shoreline master program. And these provide policies and regulations specific to guiding development in the shoreline area. Shorelines refer to marine waters, lakes, kind of lakes and larger bodies of water that are greater than 20 acres in size, rivers and streams. I think it's greater than 20 CFS. There are maps that the county has to help you determine if you're actually in one of these areas. I think I'll show an example of one of those on my next slide. But the goal of these regulations are to balance different broad policy areas within the Shoreline Management Act. So environmental protection is certainly one of them, but they also, are intended to balance that with public access and enjoyment of shoreline areas, as well as priority shoreline uses. And that's where a lot of the kind of local governance aspect can kind of come into play, kind of determining what are, priority shoreline uses, which tend to be, uses that require to be on the shoreline. So this is an excerpt of kind of what that map looks like at the Snohomish County level. So you can kind of see all these colored areas. So it's the whole floodplain of the Stillaguamish River here. You can see this area around the lake. So in addition to the kind of shorelines that I just rattled off there, similar to the critical areas, the shoreline jurisdiction also extends 200 feet landward of that. So this spot you see like around this lake is a 200-foot wide zone around that. And you'll see that there's all these different colors here. And so that in those shoreline zones, there are kind of different sets of policies and regulations depending on where you are. So some are considered natural areas, some are urban. So you can kind of imagine that there's different policies and regulations about what types of development or what types of activities might be allowed, or what kind of stipulations might be put on them in those different kinds of areas. So just kind of stepping back again, bringing it back to our layers of regulations, we just kind of touched on these local sets of regulations, and much more quickly and much more briefly than I wish I could. And I'm going to go even quicker through these ones. So at the state level, the Department of Fish and Wildlife enforces something called a hydraulic project approval. So has been touched on briefly with the kind of beavers. Basically anything you're doing in a stream and on the stream bank bed to kind of that might alter the flow over the stream, even if you're not touching it. So, building a bridge over a stream, that all requires an HPA from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that's definitely one to be cognizant of as you're kind of thinking about working in the stream. They also have local area habitat biologists who kind of manage the permitting kind of in their local jurisdiction. And they tend to be available to kind of come out and, similar to, the way Thomas or myself can come out and, talk through issues on your property. They can kind of come out if you have something in mind and kind of give you a sense of what the sticking points might be, or what they may or may not be able to permit in a given situation. Some folks, again, similar to the SMP, some folks who live on larger, rivers or larger streams might be on waters of the state. And so any work that actually is involving the bed of that stream may be on state-owned aquatic lands, or bottomlands that are regulated by the Department of Natural Resources at the state level. So something to be conscious of. At the federal level, there are a couple agencies that could potentially have permit processes triggered. These tend to be mostly in play on kind of like larger in-stream projects. So with the Army Corps of Engineers, it's primarily, fill within a stream. So that big, log restoration project I showed earlier could potentially trigger something like that. Fill, some sort of fill project in the stream bed, things like that. But you often will not have to deal with these, but they're definitely something to be aware of. Some kind of general permit requirements that you'll run into as you're permitting work in or near a stream. The big one is work windows. So particularly if you're doing work in the water, your permit will include a stipulation that there's a specific work window that your work has to be limited to. And that's typically in the kind of summer, late summer, early fall. Typically when flows are low and fish are less likely to be in the area, as a way to kind of minimize the potential to impact them. But that will vary kind of depending on where you are and depending on the jurisdiction with the permit. You'll likely be asked to monitor and control erosion and turbidity. So that could be erosion that is, causing sediment to flow into the stream, or if you're actually working in the stream and stirring things up, you'll be asked to kind of take steps to kind of make sure that you're not kicking that sediment further downstream. As Rob and Thomas both mentioned, that can have harmful impacts on water quality and aquatic life in the stream. If you're having to disturb vegetation to do your work, you'll have to kind of revegetate that area as soon as possible afterwards. And then permits will include stipulations that you'll need to kind of stay in contact, in communication with the permitting agency. If anything with your plan changes, it's common, as you're working in the field, you encounter constraints or things just don't work the way they were intended, or things have to get field adjusted. So just making sure you're in contact and communicating openly. So that was quick, but bringing it back to my bullet points, just want to kind of impress that there are these overlapping layers of regulations. So I tried to give a brief idea of kind of what those cover and entail. But the main takeaway is just to be conscious that there are, there's not just one place to look. You kind of have to be aware of these different layers and that they can be challenging and confusing. So please reach out if you have questions, and we'll do the best we can or point you in the direction of folks who can hopefully help you further. Again, I'm not actually, I'm with Snohomish County, but I'm not part of the regulatory department. That's the Department of Planning and Development Services. So a lot of times I can do my best to answer your question, give you a general framework, but often I kind of have to point you to PDS to kind of ask specifics and, get into the finer details. And I will kind of just close out with a little bit of info on getting support. So if you're, wanting to kind of move forward, you have questions, there are a lot of resources out there for you to kind of get assistance to kind of figure out what your next steps are. And I can touch on kind of what if you don't want to work with a regulating agency. I've kind of said, I work for a regulating agency in Snohomish County, but I'm in an explicitly non-regulatory position. The Conservation District is a non-regulatory agency. So even though we're both government, our roles are to be there to assist you and help you kind of figure out how to navigate things as clearly as possible, not to bust you. So we're definitely here to be a resource, but there are definitely other resources out there available if you have any kind of misgivings about inviting the government out to your property. So where to find help? I'll still start with a pitch for Thomas and myself, or us folks at the Conservation District and the county. We're really here to be a resource for you. That's why we put on this workshop. We offer site visits. You can come out, talk through any situations you have, and provide the best resources we can. And depending on the situation, can often provide additional assistance and resources to kind of move a project forward. At the state level, there are a number of agencies that can kind of provide assistance to Streamside landowners. All three of these agencies actually provided funding for tonight's workshop. So they're invested in kind of assisting landowners. There are kind of nuances to kind of where their main areas and interest are, but feel free to reach out and we can kind of point you to whoever might be the best resource for you. There are a number of local nonprofits that are really active in doing kind of restoration work and working with landowners to do restoration work in our area. These three I have here are Sound Salmon Solutions, the Adopt a Stream Foundation, and the Wild Fish Conservancy. So they can all be great resources for you if you're interested in doing projects. Sound Salmon tends to do a lot of kind of riparian restoration work along the lines of what Thomas was kind of giving an overview of, as do the county and the Conservation District. But they can also work with you to potentially fund and help permit, larger restoration projects, in-stream work, larger kind of in-stream restoration work. And that's really a big focus of the Adopt a Stream Foundation as well. And in our area, there are also a couple of local tribes that are very active in kind of working to do restoration work with streams. Up in the Stillaguamish watershed, that's primarily the Stillaguamish tribe. And for folks kind of in the Snohomish watershed or kind of further south in the county, could be more likely to be the Tulalip tribe. I also just wanted to give a quick plug. So we mentioned that this workshop has been funded through grants that we have both at the county and the Conservation District. And we do actually currently have some remaining grant funds to help landowners implement restoration projects on their properties. Really focused on salmon-bearing streams, but potentially with that funding, we can kind of provide assistance through that whole process, the planning, site prep, planting, and maintenance, which can be a big help in kind of getting that established. We have not a ton of funding left in our current grant, but we're seeking additional funding now. And I would just encourage anybody, if you're interested in this, potentially doing a restoration project, to reach out to Thomas or myself or any of the other agencies kind of on the last slide. There are a lot of different resources we can tap into to try and find something that'll work. And depending on the situation, that might just be kind of helping you map out, plan a project, get you, connected with a good plant list and resources to source those. We might be able to throw some free trees at you, all the way up to potentially being able to find funding for an entire project. So definitely reach out and we can kind of figure out what we can provide for you. And with that, to kind of close out, we'll do a little Q&A, but just wanted to kind of give one last acknowledgement to our funders. The county currently has grant funding through the EPA and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Natural Resources at the state level. And the district currently has funding from the Department of Ecology, all of which are kind of being pulled to be able to put this workshop on for you tonight. So we're really grateful to have that funding and to have this opportunity to be able to put this workshop on and connect with you all. And with that, we can take some questions.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Thomas and Rob. That was really great.
Yeah.
I learn something new every time. Okay, so one of the first questions we have, it says, this grant funding is only for unincorporated Snohomish County, yes, not incorporated?
That is correct in this specific instance. I don't know, but again, if you're interested in doing a restoration project, I would certainly encourage reaching out because there are other resources we can tap into potentially. Not making promises, but that's kind of what we do, is kind of try and find opportunities and then see if we can match that to the kind of suite of funding programs and resources that are out there.
Thomas, can you speak to the conservation district? Would we have any available funding for certain cities?
Yeah, there's a potential, depending on where you are, that we have kind of in the Lake Stevens, Snohomish, Lower Snohomish Basin, we have some current active funding that could be appropriate for certain sites. But like Alex said, there's also just a desire for us to connect with landowners who have potential projects and have an interest in doing something on their property. We like to get people on a list and say, hey, if funding comes up in this area, say it's the Pilchuck River, or say it's the Lower Snohomish, Woods Creek, if something comes up, we like to have a list of people that we can contact and say, hey, are you still interested in this? Because we have this funding available. And so whether or not we have funding at the moment, please reach out to us and we can provide a site visit. We can talk about what funding could look like, whether it's now or in the future, and make sure we can remain connected so that as you manage your property, we can help you with that as things change and as funding becomes available.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas.
Appreciate that. Do any of you know a source for testing pollutants in a stream?
We have a stream monitoring program. We have 2 or 3 different kinds. And I can put up the web address here in the answer box to check. So the types, we test for a couple of different types of metals, copper and zinc, I mentioned in that portion of the webinar. But we do test for nutrients as well as a variety of other types of variables, but I'll go ahead and do that.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
We have another question come in. It states that their property has a creek. How do I determine if it's salmon bearing? Also, my house is less than 150 feet from the creek bank. Is that within the buffer zone? What is the impact? Would my house be grandfathered in at all if it was built more than 100 years ago?
Yeah, at 100 years, you're safe. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So 2 parts. So the salmon bearing, there are definitely some resources, kind of mapping resources that are out there that can usually help you pretty quickly figure out what kind of stream you're likely to have. They're not always completely accurate, but you could usually figure out if you're likely to be on a salmon bearing stream or not. If the ones that are immediately coming to mind, our Department of Fish and Wildlife has one called Salmonscape. So you can, if you just Google WDFW Salmonscape, you could navigate to that, and it's just kind of an interactive map, so you can kind of navigate to where your house is, click on the stream, and it'll kind of pull up and show you what type of fish species might be in there, or what type of stream it might be. The county also has similar data in our mapping kind of portal, so you could search PDS map portal. Stands for Planning and Development Services, but that has a bunch of information. It's not quite as easy to navigate for that information, so I tend to use the Salmonscape one. But if you're having any issues navigating that and are curious, feel free to just like send me an email with your address, and I'd be happy to look it up for you. In terms of the grandfathering, so yes, the critical areas regulations that I talked about are relatively recent phenomenon. So that is super duper common, that, you know, my entire property is within 150 feet of the stream, or got my house and my yard and all this stuff within that, you know, buffer. And so yes, that is grandfathered in. You're allowed to kind of maintain your existing use. But the kind of question comes into play when you're talking about then kind of modifying that. So for example, your house within 150 feet of the stream, if you wanted to, you know, remodel your house, potentially even, you know, tear it down and rebuild in the exact same footprint, that's kind of one thing. If you said, I want to tear my house down and, you know, build one twice the size, where you're kind of expanding it into that buffer further, that would be kind of where the bugaboo kind of would come into play there. So there's definitely gray area in that kind of scenario, but the short answer is yes, you're grandfathered in, but it can be a little more nuanced when you're talking about kind of, if you're trying to propose something from there, kind of what can you still do and what can't, you know, what might trigger the permit process moving forward.
Thanks, Alex. I put the link to the Salmonscape website in the typed answer comment. So if you wanted to refer to that as well, it's fairly easy to use.
Thanks, Sarah.
Any other questions, folks? I know this is a lot of information. We're recording this, and we'll send a link to the recording once it's up on our YouTube page. So if you all need to refer back or feel like you missed something, no worries. We got it all documented.
I could have kept talking about regulations for 10 more minutes.
Possibly.
Bummer. Yeah.
And Sarah, we are probably sending out a set of links and resources for folks to continue to explore some of the concepts here. Is that right?
We will have some resources available. Yes, and so we will work as a team to get those all combined into one email to send it to folks who attended and then those who couldn't attend. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Thomas.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, just again, kind of encourage. I mean, we have our field tour on Saturday, so anybody who's willing to brave the weather, we'll be happy to have you. And that's, yeah, there'd be some cool things to see there. It's a restoration project that we can take a look at that has been underway. I think the landowner started about 20 years ago, putting trees in the ground in spots. And there's some newer restoration areas, lots of active beaver. So lots of cool stuff to see, and really just kind of you know, another opportunity for us to kind of hear directly from you about kind of what questions you have or what issues you're having. So definitely love to see anybody who's willing to come out.
We'll have hot coffee if that's a great enticer for folks. There'll be coffee. You'll get to see some horses trotting along. There's a nice stable there with a big arena. So please come join us. It'll be fun. Yeah, getting a lot of thank yous. Appreciate you all tonight. Yeah, this is always great to get some information, and we're all in the comfort of our own homes, except for Alex. But
Soon. Yeah.
yeah. All right, just want to do a last call for any questions, any lingering things, any clarifying comments. Great. Thank you all. Great work. All right, appreciate you all hanging in there for my little snafu at the beginning, but you know, it just lets you know we're all human, right? We don't need to take everything so seriously. Gosh. All right. Yeah, appreciate it. You all have a great evening. Stay warm. See some of you on Saturday. All right, appreciate it all.